Welcome to our first drive in the Mini Cooper S JCW trim. There is one of these in the United States, and we're driving it today. It is a car that Mini USA decided not to import. It is it's incredibly rare and interesting, to say the least. So let's twist the key as you do, and let's drop the toggle into drive. I'm actually gonna drop it to sport, and let's get going. I'm gonna tell you a little bit about this car. What is it? This is a Mini Cooper S, so this is not a JCW Mini in that it's, I guess it's not a full JCW. Let's just use that term. So the engine is the same as the F66, that's the code name, Cooper S. It is a DCT. Every Mini is now a DCT. There's no manuals anymore, so RIP manuals. Yes, it's a sad day. We wish they were still here. They're not, sadly. But it's not a bad DCT, as we will find out. And so the Cooper S is a car that we've driven before on a couple different occasions. We've tested it in the mountain roads of Montana and Idaho. We've driven it in the curviest roads we could find around Chicago, which is where we are today. And we like it. You know, generally speaking, Mini has done a lot of really nice upgrades in the platform that really dates back to the F56. This is a revised platform for the F66, and essentially it is the same thing underneath, but there's a lot of small changes. I mean, a lot of small changes. Even the track is wider, for instance. Almost every body panel is different. The headlights are different. Everything is, and not just a different headlight. It's actually, you know, the sort of the form, the sort of the shape, and even the placement. The interior is completely new. So 100% new technology everywhere, including, of course, that giant circular display, which I think we have talked a lot about on MotoringFile, and I can tell you I personally like it a great deal. It is a car that is just a dramatically different car in some ways, and yet incredibly similar to the F56 and others. One of the things that you notice right away when you get in this car, whatever trim, and even if it's the Cooper, is the fact that the steering is lighter. I would say the throttle response is much more immediate. Thank you, Mini. And interestingly, I'd say the steering also has a little bit more, you know, I hesitate to call it feedback, because I mean, truthfully, this is not actually it's not actually feedback per se, in sort of the classic sense, the sense that you might get with a Lotus or a Porsche, but it's much less synthetic in the way it feels, which is great, right? I'm actually gonna pop it into go-kart mode, which doesn't sharpen up the steering. It creates, I would say, a little bit of a heavier feeling steering. The throttle is slightly more aggressive, and critically to this car, because it's a JCW trim, it has the dynamic suspension. The suspension is, let's say, more taut, if you will. Some might call it crashy. I actually think it's not bad. And in fact, in smooth roads, it's fantastic. And you can hear the telltale signs that this is a DCT. It just sort of effortlessly, well, for one, it's holding onto a gear right now, but as it shifts very smoothly. We'll talk about that in a second. So there's a lot of upgrades on this car which make it a better daily, no doubt about it. And in so many ways, this is a better daily driver for the vast majority of people out there. I'm gonna just really rapid fire go over a couple criticisms before I talk about the actual JCW trim that we're looking at here today. So a couple criticisms that we and others have levied against this car. For one, no more manual, as I mentioned. That sucks. There's no excuse in my view. Mini should have somehow retained it. I know it costs more money, but it is, in my mind, such an sort of instrumental part of the brand until you go all electric. I think it's something that should be celebrated, and it really differentiates the brand. I could go on and on about it. It's really unfortunate. It's not coming back. It's sad. Okay, so that sucks. But even worse, in the United States, you cannot get shift paddles. So, you know, quite literally, you went from having a manual, or at least an automatic with shift paddles, to no manual, no shift paddles, no way to change any gear whatsoever in your car at all. And let's be honest, like, most people don't use the shift paddles who have an automatic, but I'd say a lot of people that do love them, and a lot of people that do just like the fact that they're there. If they need to, if the drive is perhaps a little boring, they can shift up and down. They can kind of pretend that, you know, they're Lewis Hamilton heading into a corner, et cetera, et cetera. So why? I guess let's start there. So why? So Mini USA, and this gets to the car that we're driving today, which is of course very, very unique. Mini USA decided not to import the JCW trim in the two-door hardtop, the F66. They did it with the F65 because they figured, hey, there's not going to be a full JCW model of the F65, which is the four-door Mini Cooper. So let's at least give the folks the JCW trim. Great, right? What appears to have been a late sort of breaking change at the global level caught Mini USA out, which is Mini Global decided to tie the shift paddles solely to the JCW trim, which meant because Mini USA decided not to bring the JCW trim in the two-door F66, the car we're driving today, and sort of the classic Mini Cooper, that means you just simply can't get any kind of shift paddles with the Mini Cooper at all. So you went from a manual or at least shift paddles to zero in the sportiest car that Mini sells. So it is a really unfortunate situation that Mini USA has found itself in. We've heard from a lot of folks who, whether they sell these cars, whether there are other journalists reviewing these cars, it seems just unbelievable that that would have been a decision made by Mini Global, to be very clear. And it just doesn't make any sense. Why not have shift paddles in every car? And I would personally very much agree with that concept. You know, I've written about it. Others have written about it. We've talked about it in the podcast as well. So this is a JCW trim, and it's in the United States. Well, what the heck is it doing in this country? Why am I driving this car? It's an interesting story. So Mini USA has brought, actually, it's not one of one. I think there's a couple. They've brought a couple over to test the waters. So journalists can drive this car and essentially can review the JCW trim as maybe a preview of what might come. Mini USA might offer the JCW trim down the road, and that might actually alleviate some of the criticism we have. It's also a preview of, stay with me here, the full JCW model. So the full JCW model will have the same 231 horsepower, 228 perhaps in the United States. There's always a slight deviation there, and quite a bit more torque, 258 foot-pound of torque this time. So it's actually got more power, same power, more torque. It's an exciting car. It's going to be DCT only. It sort of sucks, but why does this car preview that? Because it looks identical, literally identical. Everything about this car is the same as the JCW, except for there's a couple little pieces of red trim on the outside. The brakes on the JCW will be a little larger. The suspension, I'm told, will be slightly more aggressive. The front brakes will be 4-pot, just to be clear, 4-piston versus what we have here. And that's kind of it. Of course, the engine's different. I don't want to gloss over that fact. I mean, this is, you know, so that's kind of the magic, if you will, of the JCW F66 and F56 for that matter. And so there's some differences there, great. But the interior is the same, the seats are the same. I mean, quite literally everything is the same. So, you know, in a sense, you're not only getting a preview of what the JCW trim could be with this car, if they brought it to the United States, and of course those of you outside the United States, which is a lot of our audience. In fact, it's sometimes over half. There's a lot of setup with this car because it's such an interesting one. What do we think about it? You know, I think it's fair to say that, you know, generally speaking, we have reviewed this car fairly well. We've talked about it on the podcast fairly well, as I've mentioned. And what this car does is just takes it up maybe a notch. And so what I mean by that is there's a couple things that feel different in this car. For one, while this car doesn't have the full JCW brakes, it does have a higher friction brake pad, which is just better for stopping, a little bit better brake feel. That's nice. The suspension is of the sort of adaptive variety, meaning when I put it in go-kart mode, it actually becomes stiffer. and it allows for the chassis, everything just to feel stiffer. It allows for, I'd say, a better isolation in the way the steering responds, which is great. The steering is quicker than before on all Minis, but on this car, the quicker steering, it kind of comes alive a little bit more in the JCW Trim, because the suspension, when you go into go-kart mode, it does become a little bit more aggressive, and you feel it. You feel that sort of, you know, again, I hesitate to call feedback, but you feel more confident in the corners. You know where the car is from a placement standpoint, which is really nice. Of course, the other thing, which I just, you know, talked about, I'll talk about it again, is this car has shift paddles, and that's also nice. You know, this is a great transmission, and one of the things that's interesting about this transmission is it is almost predictive in the way it shifts. Meaning, I head into a corner, it seems to know that corner's there, probably GPS. It will actually downshift for me into from third to second, for instance, sometimes as I'm thinking about doing it. And so there is such a great predictive quality to this, the transmission, the software behind it, that I find myself not needing to shift using the paddles as much as I would in my 2024 JCW Clubman, for instance, which had the old ASIN 8-speed automatic. So that's an interesting point here. What I'm trying to say is that, yes, there are shift paddles in this car, but in some situations, you actually don't need them as much as you might think you do. Maybe that's a plus for not needing them at all. I think that still doesn't make any sense, but for those of you who don't have them, didn't get them on your car, I guess feel a little bit better about that, because damn, the suspension, or the transmission is really predictive, which is awesome. A couple other things though about this transmission and shift paddles specifically. This is got the same issue that I found on the JCW Countryman as well. So that car has the same transmission, same DCT 7-speed. And what I've found in that car is, specifically with upshifts, as I'm going, let's say, to second and to third, there are moments where I will hit it and nothing will happen, and then it happens. It's like a second and a half late. So now I'm down to first, for instance. So I'm gonna go up to second, locked, and it's the second to third, and you couldn't see when I clicked, but first to second, it was like that, and it felt like it locked up, and it was awesome. That's exactly when it snaps, and you want it to feel like that when you're really, really on it. But from second to third, there's anywhere from a slight hesitation to a legitimate lag. And that's interesting to me, because I've now sensed that in both the Countryman JCW and this car, the F66 JCW. So it almost seems like it's inherent in the hardware/software of this transmission. It doesn't happen consistently. There's moments where there's almost no lag. There's moments when there's no lag. There's moments when there's a real lag. And I think that's the thing that's let's just say again, kind of an interesting little foible here with this transmission and the software. Doesn't mean I wouldn't want the paddles and I wouldn't stop using them. But this is not a dual clutch of the, let's say, Porsche or BMW M variety, which they don't even make anymore. This is a dual clutch that's, let's be honest, designed for a certain price point and daily driving. And in that way, as I sort of like step back for a bit, it's a great transmission. So the paddles, I didn't think Mini could make the paddles worse. The previous paddles on these cars were small, the shift paddles, that is. They were made of plastic that wasn't the best, and they didn't necessarily inspire a lot of, let's say, confidence when you click them, and they're clicky, like it's a little click. And if you have ever driven a Porsche or have even just sat in those cars and felt how they feel, there is a world of difference between those cars and this car, which is unfortunate. You want that feel. That's the feel you want, and you don't get it in this car, which is a big bummer. I think the interesting thing about the Cooper S, and with the paddles, of course, is that they're here. You want to use them, especially with the forthcoming JCW. You want to use them, and the actual act of clicking them isn't satisfying. It feels like you're clicking little buttons, and to be honest with you, that's a big disappointment. Mini should have and could have spent a little bit more money and done something a little bit more, I wouldn't even say upmarket, just designed them a little bit differently, made them a little bit sturdier, and I think critically here, made them about a 1/4 inch taller. They didn't have to even be much taller, because as it stands now, to use them, you really have to drive your car with your hands on the wheel at a 9-3 position, which isn't wrong at all. But if you drive up at a 10-2, you really cannot use the paddles whatsoever, or at the very least, like maybe with your pinkies. So not really the best design from a spatial perspective, not the best design from a material perspective either. And then of course, not the most responsive in terms of how they actually take your input and transform that into an action. So yeah, not ideal. Still, they're here, and when you use them, and once you sort of reorient your hands to 10 and 2, they're great. They work almost all the time very well. You know, it does make the car more engaging, you know, and I wish they're in every single one of these cars. I think that's a definite. So really nice addition, and the JCW Trim is one that, you know, I personally think is a no-brainer. I don't know why they wouldn't offer it here on the face of it. Now, why did they not offer it here? Well, as I mentioned earlier, it does take away from the actual JCW product itself, because it's identical. I mean, and that makes sense. I mean, that is a legitimate reason why you wouldn't want to have it on this car as an entity like Mini USA, because you're trying to sell a more expensive car that looks the same. And you know, like, most people are going to look at it and say, well, wait a second, everything is the same visually. The performance is different, but it's not that different. So why would I spend the extra money? And so I sort of get that. So having had this car for 7 days, driven a fair amount of miles on it, well over 600 miles, you know, I stand by the fact that Mini should have differentiated the JCW more, the full JCW, from the JCW Trim. But that said, I really do believe that Mini USA needs to bring this car here. This is the only market that it's not available in. Of course, all of our viewers, which are probably more than 50% of you out there that are not in the US, go and look at this car. This is the pick of the F66 range, as far as I'm concerned. It's got a better suspension, better brakes, and of course shift paddles. I'd say the interior is, from a visual perspective, better resolved as well. The exterior is a little more aggressive for sure. Darker colors will kind of rein that in a little bit. But this is the pick of the range, and I am just so glad that I was able to actually drive it, and in a lot of ways truly kind of realize what the F66 is and can be. That is, of course, until we drive the full JCW, which is coming very soon. As always, thank you for watching. Give us a like if you like the video. Subscribe. We have a lot more coming.